and she forgot the most important thing, which is that today is my birthday. And actually, I'm so delighted to be spending it with all of you and learning some Torah. So it's a little bit of a hard topic, but really, truly getting to teach some Torah for my birthday is a great gift. So thank you for spending it with me. I'm 37 today. It feels like a great age to be today. So what we're going to do is we are going to read two Midrashim today. Both from Dirshuni, if you've been following along in this session. They are books of modern Israeli women's Midrash. There's 2 volumes. We're waiting for the forthcoming English volume. So one of the Midrashim is in volume 1, and one is in volume 2. Actually, the Midrash that we're going to read, the second Midrash we're going to read today is from Tamar Biala, who's the author that will be joining us in February and who we've been learning up until now. And the first Midrash we're going to learn is from Rivka Lubitch. And Tamar's Midrash, there is a reason we're going to learn both of these, because Tamar actually references Rivka Lubitch's Midrash in her Midrash. So the same way when I told you Tamar Biala is always referencing everything, she's pulling from the Torah, she's pulling from classical Midrash and the Talmud, she's pulling from, modern history and social, what's going on in the world today. She's also pulling in the second volume from the Midrashim, from the other Midrashim that the other women have written in the first volume, to really continue to build the world. That's what Midrash truly is. So that will be an exciting thing to see how that works, just in terms of how modern Midrash is already building on itself. And you'll see in the title that I picked for this class, that what we're going to look at today is Midrash as a tool for helping us to handle difficult texts. That there are pieces of our, sometimes we're using Midrash just to help us go deeper or fill in gaps or elaborate on a beautiful moment in our text, right? But it's a different thing when we look specifically for the most difficult moments in our text, and we have to grapple with them, right? When we force ourselves to look directly at them and we don't allow ourselves to look away, and we say, we don't get to cut and paste, right? There's some people's approach to religion might be, sure, that part of the Torah, I find it offensive, so we cut that line out. That's not generally how we approach Torah, right? That's not how we approach Tanakh more broadly, the Bible as a whole. We take it as all, and we take it as holy. And then we can't overlook the difficult parts. We have to look them in the eye and grapple with them. And what we're going to look at today is how can Midrash, and in particular modern Midrash, be actually a tool to help us read those difficult texts. So I heard Tamar say once that she started writing Midrash in order to remain religious. That for her, Midrash is the tool that allows her to stay inside, right? She would have seen certain things in the text and run far away from Judaism, but Midrash allowed her to incorporate and understand those hard things differently. So I want to start with finding that place within yourself. We're going to read the Midrashim that these women thought were the most difficult texts, the most difficult stories in our tradition. But I want to stop for a minute. I'm going to open up my chat so I can see and invite you to put into the chat, is there a story from the Torah? Is there a Jewish text or a Jewish idea that is really hard for you to grapple with? I would say maybe it's cringy at best, right? It makes you cringe when you hear that, and maybe really actually hurtful at worst, right? This is an idea. So the first one is the Akedah. That's definitely on the list for me, right? When you really study it, the Akedah is, of course, the binding of Isaac, the idea that God is telling Abraham to kill his son. The rape of Dinah is here a lot, right? The murder of Shechem. I saw the story of Sota. Sota is how you deal with an accused woman. It's really hard to read those texts. That's interesting, actually. A lot of the same Lot's offering his daughters is definitely on that list for me, right? If you may see this list go by and these stories look familiar to you, or you may be watching this list go by in the chat and you don't know these stories, which don't feel bad. And I would say you can go and look them up. And also you have your trigger warning, right? You know that these are going to be really difficult. Okay, we heard somebody said Jephthah's daughter is Yiftach's daughter. And Yiftach's daughter is actually the text we're going to pick up on today. That's the text we're going to start with, because that is, right, all of the above. There are a lot of difficult moments in Torah, right? We know that, and we sometimes look at them and we sometimes look away from them. Today, we're going to focus on the story of Bat Yiftach, the daughter of Yiftach. I'm going to just give you like the really, really distant bird's eye view of the story. And then we're just going to read 2 verses and then we'll see what Rivka Lubitch does. So that's the text that Rivka Lubitch chooses to take on. She is by day an activist lawyer, okay? And I think that you will hear that in her Midrash. You will understand that from her Midrash. But to give you a sense of who are modern Israeli women who write Midrash, Rivka Lubitch is another character that we'll introduce, and another real person that we'll introduce, who's this activist lawyer who wrote a Midrash about the story of the daughter of Yiftach. So Yiftach is a general in the book of Judges, right? He's fighting a battle and he says, if we win this battle, God, I will sacrifice the first thing that greets me when I get home, the first thing that comes out of my house. The citation's on the handout, but we're going to look at it together in a second. I'm just going to do the storytelling, setting the scene, and then we'll look at it together. Yiftach says, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. And then when he comes home, what's the first thing that comes out of his house to greet him? Is his daughter, right? It's not clear exactly, like he didn't account for that. It didn't occur to him that his daughter could be the one who comes out to him. It's also not clear why he doesn't say, well, I obviously meant the first animal. He actually takes it seriously. You know, he sort of says, oh God, this isn't what I wanted. And now he's going to have to grapple with what to do with this promise that he made about sacrificing what is now his daughter. Okay, so Shirel, if you want to share the handout for us, and we will situate ourselves in the book of Judges a little bit. I put it after the Midrash, but if you scroll down for us, we can just read these 2 verses. Okay. So if you wanted to see the whole story of the daughter of Yiftach, you will go looking for it in the 11th chapter of Judges, and you can do that after class. But right now you're going to stay with us. The daughter of Yiftach says, can I go to the field? Can I go spend some time away and then I'll return? And her father says yes. And then the text tells us, after 2 months' time, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. She had never known a man. So it became a custom in Israel for the maidens of Israel to go every year for 4 days in the year and chant dirges for the daughter of Yiftach, the Gileadite. Okay, so in Hebrew, it's Litanot Labat Yiftach. That's the piece we're going to pick up on here. This is the very, very sad and tragic end of the story, right? He actually kills her, and it becomes a custom for the maidens of Israel to go for 4 days in the year. And what does this mean? Chant dirges is the translation here. It's to cry. It's to mourn, to bemoan, right? To eulogize, to chant dirges for the daughter of Yiftach. And she doesn't have a name, right? Her name in this story, she's a nameless character, is just Bat Yiftach, right? Such that when somebody in the chat wants to say, this is the story that bothers me, they can't even refer to her by name. They have to call her Bat Yiftach. Okay. This is the moment that we're going to zoom in on for Rivka's Midrash. So if you scroll back up, and we'll start to read together. I think, yeah, maybe I'll ask for a volunteer to read, just so we'll hear one voice other than mine. And I'm going to invite you to read through this, and then we'll read through it once, and then I'm going to go through and really we'll unpack it together. But if you are interested in reading and you want to raise your virtual hand, then it will bring you up to the front of the virtual class, and I'll be able to unmute you so that you could read for us. Let's see, we've had some really actually phenomenal readers, not to scare you or raise the bar too high. All right, Susan, you want to read for us? I think I made it so that you can unmute. Yeah, great.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just say that we're going to be rooted in the verse. She was an only child. He had no other sons or daughters, right? Okay, that's the verse we're playing on.
Right. The Shekhinah said to Yiftach's daughter, Yiftach had no progeny from you, and on earth they don't know that a woman has a name of her own, even without having a son or daughter. Sit with me in heaven and weep for this. On earth they call you Yiftach's daughter, and I will call you Tanot. And okay. Why was she called
finish reading it and then I'll interrupt.
Sorry. Why was she called, that's all right. And why was she called Tanot? Because it is written. And so since long ago, the daughters of Israel go to wail, Tanot, for the daughter of Yiftach, the Gileadite, 4 days a year. And they said, Tanot does not mean wailing, but is the name of Yiftach's daughter. And what does she do? She sits in heaven and listens to the stories of the earthly daughters of Israel, and then sits.
Gonna have to scroll for us a little bit. Yeah.
By the Shekhinah and bewails their sorrows in her ear, prays for them and pleads their righteousness.
Thank you so much. All right, let's unpack this. The Shekhinah said to Yiftach's daughter. It's quite an opening for a Midrash, right? The Shekhinah is the female embodied image of God, right? So that's the image of God that is called in here. Again, we were sort of discussing what makes this women's Midrash or feminist Midrash. It's definitely clear here that she's drawing on a female image. The Shekhinah says to Yiftach's daughter, Yiftach had no progeny from you, right? His name doesn't get carried on. And on earth, they don't know that a woman has a name of her own, even without having a son or a daughter. The presumption here, I think, is that the reason that Yiftach's daughter doesn't have a name is that she's just the daughter of somebody. She's not the mother of somebody. She doesn't get to have her own independent line and identity. She's sort of stuck forever in this daughter role. And the Shekhinah is going to change that, right, by giving her a name. So the Shekhinah says, sit with me in heaven and weep for this, for the fact that you don't have a name. On earth, they call you Yiftach, Bat Yiftach, and I will call you Tanot. So Tanot is the name that the Shekhinah is going to give to Yiftach's daughter. She gets invited up to sit with the Shekhinah, and that's her name. Well, that is really a weird name. Right? What is Tanot as a name? You don't know anybody named Tanot that I know of, right? Shirel, that's not a name in Israel, is it? Tanot? No. Okay. So this is right. So then she has to say, why is she called Tanot? Because it is written, and this is the verse that we looked at, right? The daughters of Israel went to wail Tanot for the daughter of Yiftach. She reads this. This is exceedingly close reading here of a text, right? As Tanot, comma, lebat Yiftach. Like if I said to Susan, comma, the woman who just read this paragraph so beautifully, right? That would be a way of saying, this is the name of the person I'm about to identify who they are. So she reads this text, Tanot, which is actually a verb that means to wail, and she rereads it to give her the name of Tanot, to Tanot, to the daughter of Yiftach, Bat Yiftach. So she has this amazing way to not just say, this woman doesn't have a name and that's not acceptable, but to find a name for her that is organically in the text, right? And this is a midrashic tool that you will definitely find this kind of reading in classical midrash, right? This super close reading that allows us to say something deeper. And then let's see what she does. Her name is to weep, right? That's her name, is this like weeping, bemoaning. And they said, but no, that's not how we're going to read it. Tanot does not mean wailing, but that's her name. And what does she do? She sits in heaven and she becomes the intermediary between the women on earth who are suffering, and the Shekhinah, right? She sits in heaven and she listens to the stories of the earthly daughters of Israel. And then she sits by the Shekhinah and she bewails their sorrows in her ear, prays for them, and pleads for their righteousness. So one, I would say, like, there's a little bit of this image which is drawn, I think, from like a Yom Kippur image, right? On Yom Kippur, we have this image that there's like prosecutors and defenses, you know, prosecuting attorneys and defense attorneys who are up there pleading our case. And here, Tanot is this character who gets to live forever sitting with the Shekhinah, right? Sitting close to God, and becomes this spokesperson. This spokesperson for the wronged women of Israel. And this is an incredible thing that she's done here. What she's done here is she's taken a story about a woman who had no agency, right? Bat Yiftach, as a character, is essentially entirely victim. And she's totally flipped that on its side, right? Instead of just an identity as victim, she is now the person who is up in heaven. She's now the advocate, right? She's now the lawyer. She's now the activist. And I think one of the things that's so powerful about this image is that this is a tool that works, right? I first started pulling at this Midrash because I was looking to teach a class that I wanted to call Torah for the Me Too movement, right? And what do you do? Like, how do you approach a situation where you've been victimized? One path that works for some women, not all women, but for some women, to climb out of a place where they feel stuck in an identity as victim is to turn into activist, right? Is to turn into a person who hears other victims' cries and helps them advocate for what they need to pull them out of their painful situations. And that can be an incredibly powerful and empowering move for someone who feels that they were a victim. And now Bat Yiftach gets to do that in this narrative, right? She gets to model for us what it means to turn, right? Rivka Lubitsch, in writing this Midrash, turns her from a character who has no agency, who's just a victim, into this character with this sort of amazing agency. She actually has the direct ear of God. And now she's almost like, you know, she's the person that you would reach out to, right? If you are a woman who feels like you are the victim of violence, or you're going to be, or you're, you know, that Bat Yiftach is now Tanot, and she's now a person that you can turn to, a character, an idea that's up there and that you can turn to. And her sorrow, her weeping now has a purpose, right? She's not weeping, you know, for those who heard me teach the first two sessions, I've talked a lot about the way that Tamar has written about tears and how she's like claiming tears, and also the fact that I've heard her cry while teaching, and that I feel like she's reclaiming tears in using them as like, yeah, you can cry while you're teaching. That's an amazing thing. It sort of blew me away. And here, this is also like a change of what does it mean to cry and wail from something that is sort of like powerless to something actually extremely powerful. Right. So the naming gives her power. The tears give her power. She has this amazing identity. That's Midrash number one that I want to introduce you to, in part because it's beautiful on its own, and also because that's where Tamar is going to build on this legacy. And Tamar, I know from talking to her, has said like, oh yeah, Tanot. She was so moved by this Midrash that Tanot became a character in her family's lives, that they started to refer to Tanot or to think about Tanot, like what is she doing, or what is she advocating for? Or you would read something in the paper, right? And you'd be able to say, this is a story for Tanot to bring to the Shekhinah. Somebody up there needs to be listening to this story. So that alone, I think, is like, you could take that as an example of how to use Midrash as a way to think about difficult text and think about difficult experiences, not only on the page, but also in our lives ourselves. Okay, we're going to move to the next text. And I'm going to ask you actually to scroll all the way down past her Midrash, and we're going to start in Ezekiel. Okay, so there's different texts. I said you each have it. Keep going all the way down. This is a long one, but I promise it will move quickly when we actually start reading it. Okay, we'll stay here with Ezekiel. There are different texts that bother different people. And I want to say really clearly that not everybody that I know reads this Ezekiel passage as problematic. I personally really struggle with this passage from Ezekiel. It's one of the passages that I find hardest to read. And you'll see, we'll stay here. You don't have to scroll down, but you'll see I put below the fact that this passage gets quoted. This is not like a random problematic passage from Ezekiel, right? I did not find this passage. Tamar did not find this passage by saying, let's find the most offensive thing in the whole Bible, and then let's tackle that, right? That maybe is true of the story of Bat Yiftach. That is one of the most problematic passages in every that exists, right? This Ezekiel is a central text in our Jewish liturgy, right? This Ezekiel text is referenced in the Haggadah, and it's referenced in the bris, baby naming ceremony when we have a bris. So this comes up actually. This comes up in our lives. And every time it comes up, I bristle. So we could talk about why, but I want us to read it. I feel personally so grateful that Tamar wrote a Midrash to grapple with this because it really bothers me. But I should just say I have female feminist Hadar colleagues who don't have the same gut reaction to this text as I do. So whichever way you react to it as we hear it now, it's reasonable. You're not wrong if you're not offended by it, but also you're not wrong if you are offended by it. Susan, do you maybe want to read this one also for us, Ezekiel? It's a little bit long, and I want us to hear the whole thing, and then we'll unpack it a little bit.
Sure. The word of the Lord. Yeah, sure. The word of the Lord came to me. O mortal, proclaim Jerusalem's abominations to her and say, thus said the Lord God to Jerusalem, by origin and birth, you are from the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. As for your birth, when you were born, your navel cord was not cut, and you were not bathed in water to smooth you. You were not rubbed with salt, nor were you swaddled. No one pitied you enough to do any one of these things for you out of compassion for you. On the day you were born, you were left lying, rejected in an open field. When I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you, live in spite of your blood. Yea, I said to you, live in spite of your blood. I let you grow like the plants of the field, and you continued to grow up until you attained to womanhood, until your breasts became firm and your hair sprouted. You were still naked and bare when I passed by you again and saw that your time for love had arrived. So I spread my robe over you and covered your nakedness. And I entered into a covenant with you by oath, declares the Lord God. Thus you became mine. I bathed you in water and washed the blood off you and anointed you with oil. I clothed you with embroidered, I can't see because somebody's chatting down below and I can't see the rest. I clothed you with embroidered garments and gave you sandals of dolphin leather to wear and wound fine linen about your head and dressed you in silks. I decked you out in finery and put bracelets on your arms and a chain around your neck. I put a ring in your nose and earrings in your ears and a splendid crown on your head. Yeah. You adorned yourself with gold and silver, and your apparel was of fine linen, silk, and embroidery. Your food was choice flour, honey, and oil. You grew more and more beautiful and became fit for royalty. Your beauty won you fame among the nations, for it was perfected through the splendor which I set upon you, declares the Lord God. But confident in your beauty and fame, you played the harlot. You lavished your favors on every passerby. They were his.
All right. Pretty intense. Thank you for reading it. I wonder how many of you feel like, yes, you've actually taken in this whole passage as is. This is a metaphor for our relationship with God, right? This is the metaphor for our relationship with God. That's how I feel, right? I feel like, okay, it's like you're this unloved baby. That's the beginning image, right? Really not cared for at all. God is going to come along and like totally take care of you and raise you. But then suddenly when you become of age, become your sexual partner instead of your your parent at that point. And then we end with this image of like, I gave you everything and you ungrateful, you went whoring with other gods in other nations, right? It is a very strong image. And again, I'll say there are, I know people, you know, who really read this and they think it's beautiful and they resonate. That's not, that is obviously how it was read for generations. Like people, Jews for generations have found this to be really powerful and compelling. And that's why it made its way into our Haggadah and into the bris ceremony. I find, I don't know if you have this custom of at your Seder table where you just go around and you say to every person, like, just read the next paragraph. And then suddenly some person finds themselves saying, when I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said, you know, you were naked and barren. And then that person's like, what am I reading? Like, what's happening right now? And you sort of have that bristle moment. And I should say that this, when, you know, live in spite of your blood, in the bris ceremony, that's actually a line that you pause and everybody in the room repeats back in a traditional recitation of that liturgy. And every time I look around the room and I think, this is beautiful and I love that baby. And why are we quoting this verse from Ezekiel that I find to be so problematic? So that's we're setting the stage. This is the text that Tamar is going to take us through. And I'll just say, just the fact that she wrote the Midrash is meaningful to me because I've never really heard anyone call attention to this Ezekiel passage or claim that it was problematic. This was like just my own internal in my mind, you know, as a rabbi and lover of Jewish texts, that I always think like, this is a hard one for me. I don't understand this text. Okay, so scroll back up and I will take you through Tamar's take on it. Again, the big frame we're working with is how can we use modern Midrash as a tool for, yes, I would say the kind of modern Haggadot that are cutting texts might have cut this piece, but it also might be it might be that when you go through your Haggadah this year, you'll see it and you'll say, oh, I didn't realize this had that context, but that's what's happening. It's in the Magid section. Okay. Tamar Biala, we're back to her, right? It took us a while, but here we are. Tamar Biala is going to root this Midrash that she's going to offer us in two different texts from the Talmud and two different texts from the Bible. And she's going to weave them all together. So she's going to start us off with these two different texts from the Talmud. I think I'm just going to read them because I would just interrupt the reader so much that it's probably not fair to pick another reader. Rav Yehuda said, this is from the Talmud Bavli and Chagiga. Rav Yehuda said, yet let us fondly remember that man, and Hanina ben Chizkiah was his name. If not for him, the book of Ezekiel would have been hidden away, for it contradicted things in the Torah. So the book of Ezekiel, right, we have this problem if you try to read the Bible closely, that it doesn't always match up, right? That one section, you know, something seems one way and another section, it seems another way. So this probably is actually referring to the idea that like the book of Ezekiel will give some narrative or reference back to the Torah, but the way that it describes something isn't how it's described in the Torah. And then the ancient rabbis, have to reconcile that, right? They have to say, I don't understand. Ezekiel thinks this, but actually the Torah said that. How do we put those together? That's probably what this is referring to, right? This guy helped us. We would have had to throw out the book of Ezekiel, but because it contradicts the Torah, what did he do? They brought him 300 kegs of oil, and he sat in an attic and searched it with Midrash. It's a beautiful image on its own, right? From the Talmud. 300 kegs of oil. Why? Why oil? What's oil? Oil is how you create light, right? He is burning the midnight oil, right? He is sitting nonstop and closely reading the book of Ezekiel and writing Midrash. And his Midrash, he's looking at all the places where Ezekiel is contradicting the Torah, and he's writing Midrash that helps explain and unpack how those how is that okay, right? That's what this text means. It's a beautiful image, and we're saying we want to give praise to Hanina ben Chizkiah. He's the one who allowed us to keep Ezekiel in the Torah. And then I'm gonna like step out of character for a minute and say, like, I would want to say, like, and praise to Tamar Biala for writing a midrash that allows me to keep Ezekiel in the Torah, right? So you step back in. That's our inspiration. You can hear in the midrash that Tamar is saying, oh, maybe that's what I should do. Okay, now we have another passage from a different place. Mishnah Yadayim. Rabbi Akiva. Remember him? Rabbi Akiva says, God forbid, not a single Israelite ever disagreed and said that the Song of Songs does not render one's hands impure. For all of eternity in its entirety is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the scriptures are holy, and the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies. What? Okay, I'll explain. Rabbi Akiva loves Shir HaShirim. He loves the Song of Songs. Not all the rabbis agree. Many rabbis read the Song of Songs and they say, this is just a sexy love story and it is not about, and it has nothing to do with Torah. Why is this in the Torah? This does not belong in the Torah. The code word for belong as a holy text is, does it render your hands impure? Holy books render your hands impure when you touch them. Non-holy books don't do that. You don't need to worry too much about that. Just know that that's the code for, is this a holy book? And Rabbi Akiva says, is this a holy book? This is not a holy book. This is the holiest book. Shir HaShirim for Rabbi Akiva is one long parable of the relationship, love letters between God and the people of Israel, right? For Rabbi Akiva, that is the ultimate of what our relationship with God is this love song that we read in Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs. And for Rabbi Akiva, that is the Holy of Holies. Okay, you might see those two midrashim, those two ancient classical texts, you see them as differently. Tamar sees them as together. That's the intro to her midrash. Okay, we're gonna start her midrash. Her midrash starts with Tanot asked the Shekhinah. No explanation here in her midrash of who Tanot is, right? The same way that a classical midrash does not explain to you all the background of who the characters are. Tamar just accepts the character of Tanot from Rivka Lubitch's midrash, and she places her here, and you have to know who she is, and thank God you do, because that's what we did for the first half hour. And Tanot gets to talk to the Shekhinah directly. And Tanot says to the Shekhinah, what did Ezekiel say that contradicted the Torah, right? So Tanot is studying that first passage that said Ezekiel contradicts the Torah, and Tanot says, what was so bad? What contradicted the Torah? And the Shekhinah answers, this is God, right? This is Tamar writing in the voice of God. The Shekhinah answers, he did not fulfill to be loving to your neighbor like yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you know Rabbi Akiva, you know that Rabbi Akiva believes that the ikar of the Torah, the central principle of Torah, is love your neighbor as yourself. So for Rabbi Akiva, this is actually the central principle, right? It's not that Yechezkel disagreed on some details. Yechezkel violated the central principle of the Torah, love your neighbor as yourself. For when he wanted to tell Israel how God chose them for a people and how they betrayed him, and to comfort them, that terrible things would befall them, but one day out of the blue, and they will again be loved by him, right? Ezekiel's trying to tell the future because he's a prophet. He told them all this through a parable. That's what we just read. And that parable, it was cruel and humiliated the women of the world. This is not mincing words, right? Tamar puts in the voice of the Shekhinah to say that passage from Ezekiel is offensive to women. And that violates the Torah's core principle of how you treat people, because women are people, right? It's all in this ancient midrashic language. That's what Tamar is telling us here. That passage is offensive to women. That's step one. Tanot's like, follow-up question. What were the 300 kegs of oil that they brought to him? To Hanina ben Chizkiah, that he would interpret Yechezkel, right? So this character who sat in the attic with the 300 kegs of oil and solved all the problems, that's a pretty big problem, right? How do you solve a problem that big? And the answer is they brought him Shir Hashirim. They brought him Song of Songs, as it is written, your ointments smell sweet. Your name is like finest oil, and that is why maidens love you. So she switches it here, right? It's not that you brought oil to see what you were doing, but the oil that was brought is Shir Hashirim. And here's this quote from Song of Songs that tells you that likens, that is about the finest oil. Your name is like finest oil. So the oil here is Shir Hashirim. The oil is what allows you to keep in Ezekiel, and the oil is Shir Hashirim. Tanot asked, how can one interpret Yechezkel with Shir Hashirim? Tanot says, what does that even mean? What does it mean to use one biblical text to interpret another biblical text? And now's the fun part. Now we get to see some really brilliant close textual reading by Tamar, where she is going to use quotes from Shir Hashirim to unpack and respond to some of the most problematic pieces of Yechezkel, right? So I didn't have to take that, Yechezkel is Ezekiel. I didn't have to take that Ezekiel passage and go line by line and explain to you why each one is offensive, because Tamar is going to do it for us here. We get to do it together, and then we get to have Shir Hashirim. Okay, so we'll start. We'll do section 1. The Shechina answered, Yechezkel said, you were still naked and bare when I passed by you and saw that your time for love had arrived. So I spread my robe over you and covered your nudity, and I swore a covenant to you, declares the Lord God, so you were mine. Comes Shir Hashirim and says, let's rise early to the vineyards. We'll see if the vine has bloomed, if the pomegranates have bloomed, and there I'll give my love to you. Okay, it's a little more subtle in this first one. It's going to become more and more overt. The Ezekiel verse ends with you, so you were mine, right? It's very possessive. We belong to God. And Shir Hashirim says, and the Dodi lach, and that's how I became yours, right? It's a complete reversal. That she's able to say, she's able to read Shir Hashirim as a corrective on Yechezkel. God is so possessive in Ezekiel, and in Shir Hashirim, that God gives God's self to us in a non-possessive way, in a giving way. It inverts the relationship. We'll do the next one. Yechezkel said, like mother, like daughter, you are your mother's daughter, she who rejected her man and her children. Really offensive, right? It hurts. It's like, I don't know if men find this as hurtful, but it's like, I really feel the hurt in that one, right? Comes Shir Hashirim and says, till I brought him to my mother's house, to the chamber of she who conceived me. I would lead you. I would bring you to my mother's house. Under the apple tree, I roused you. It was there that your mother conceived you. The Shir Hashirim, the Ezekiel is bringing the image of your mother to show how bad you are. It's an insult, right? When I bring in your mother's memory, it shames you. And Shir Hashirim does exactly the opposite. Shir Hashirim says, in ways that are kind of confusing and maybe creepy, but like really great in the way that she's using them. Shir Hashirim takes the mother image and says like, no, like when I think about your mother and the conception of you, that is part of the love. That's where we want to go to make love, is to your mother's house. That your mother, instead of being a negative image that makes you bad, your mother is a positive image that makes you good, right? Your mother is now a positive thing about you. It's a complete rewriting and inverse. It's a complete rewriting and inverse. It just feels like the opposite. Okay, we'll do another one. So she's just going verse by verse, and she's showing us how you can hold up the Yechezkel. You can hold up a Shir Hashirim next to the Yechezkel to find the opposite image. We'll do another one. Yechezkel says, I clothed you, wound fine linen about your head, and dressed you in silks. I covered you, right? Comes Shir HaShirim and says, let me see your face. Turn back, that we might gaze upon you. It's so powerful, right? Yechezkel says, you need to be covered. And Shir HaShirim says, you need to be seen. You need to be uncovered. And does an uncovering move. It's an exact inverse here. I think this one in particular is really powerful if I think about, some of the more modern feminist thinking about, modesty and confidence and what is it, and how you try to hold all of those ideas together to say that, like, actually sometimes covering women in order to protect them is actually harmful to them. And sometimes uncovering women allows them to say, like, yeah, you deserve to be seen. Your face should be seen. And that is the Shir HaShirim image here, right? We want to see you. Yechezkel says, let's do the next one. I didn't put a space here, sorry. Yechezkel said, and you will be too ashamed to open your mouth again. Yechezkel says, shut up. Comes Shir HaShirim and says, oh, you who linger in the garden, oh, a lover is listening, let me hear your voice. Hashmi'ini et kolech, right? I want to hear your voice. Where Yechezkel says, be quiet, Shir HaShirim says, I want to hear you. I want to draw you out. I want to see you. I want to hear you. I want you uncovered. Yechezkel says, now I will raise my arm against you and give you over to your enemies. I will direct bloody and passionate fury against you. I will deliver you into their hands, and they will tear down and level and strip you and take and gather a mob and pelt you with stones and pierce you with their swords and punish you. So violent. Comes Shir HaShirim and says, a king is held captive in the tresses and says, let me be a seal upon your hand. The first image is like an abusive image, right? God is this powerful and violent king. And in the second image, the king is held captive in her tresses, right? Her tresses are her hair. Her body is now a fortress, and she's the one in control. Her hair has entrapped the king. So if the king is always God, right? This is the ultimate opposite image, right? The king is held captive in her tresses. And the king is saying, like, let me be a seal upon your hand, right? It's not about my hand. It's about your hand. It's about your power. All of the power is into the image of the not God of the lover, right? The Bnei Israel image, the female image here. The power is totally reversed. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So we'll do this next one. Yechezkel said, confident in your beauty and fame, you played the whore. Comes Shir HaShirim and says, if you don't know, O fairest of women, go out. And added, arise, my darling, my fair one, come away. This, you might need to know, like, a little bit of background in classical midrashic, classical rabbinic texts. They usually pick up on phrases about biblical women that say she went out. People wrote about Dinah, the rape of Dinah, as a problem. It says Dinah went out. And the classical rabbis say Dinah went out shows that Dinah went out inappropriately. Women don't belong out. Women belong in. And the idea that she went out is like she went out whoring. She went out in an inappropriate way. And here the Yechezkel is, you went out to be a whore. Presumably you should have stayed in. And the Shir HaShirim is actually drawing the person out. See, go out. Lechi, go, is the Hebrew, right? Arise, and go out and come away. So there's again the opposite, right? Women should stay in, women should go out. One last one. You see, Yechezkel, I never know whether to say it in English. Yechezkel said, I will establish my covenant with you, and your beauty won you fame among the nations, perfect through the splendor which I bestowed on you, declares the Lord God. comes Shir HaShirim and says, oh, that you were my brother, and my beloved is mine, and I am his. Okay, this one's an interesting one. I think that this is what she's doing here in this one. Yechezkel says, I made you who you are, right? That's a narrative that you know, it's a trope that we know in relationships, where one person says, I made you into something. Everything you are is what I made you. And Shir HaShirim offers us these very different and maybe strange. I've always thought this was a strange line. Oh, that you were my brother, right? That is a strange way to express your love to someone. Oh, that you were my brother, in a sexy love poem, right? I think one way to read that on the regular level is like, then I'd be able to be near you and touch you. I'd be allowed to touch you if you were my brother. But I think the way she's reading it here is brotherhood is a parallel relationship, just like Dodili v'ani lo, right? My beloved is mine and I am his, is a parallel relationship. The Shir HaShirim is giving us relationships, whereas all the other ones was like exact opposites. This is, Shir HaShirim is giving us, yes, right, brotherhood as equality, or I'm yours and you're mine. It's the opposite of this like very one-sided narrative in Ezekiel, and it's a corrective, right? It's a corrective on that narrative. And here's the end. And I get choked up when I read it. It really moves me. And so it was that the Shekhinah said to Tanot. So the Shekhinah is doing all this teaching, right? The Shekhinah is the one who put all of these verses together. Draw me after you, Narutsu, let's run, is a verse from Shir HaShirim, right? Narutsu, let's run. Don't read it as Narutsu, but rather Nirtzeh, let's desire. This is a very common, if you're new to reading Midrash, it's a very common move in Midrash to take a word and to say, vocalize it differently, put different vowels around it, and then read it differently, and it will have another meaning, which, like, Hebrew is this amazing, beautiful, layered language where I like to say in Hebrew, every 3 letters in any order is a different word, right? But like, there's so, you can change a few sounds in a word and you can totally change the meaning. So Narutsu, let's run, becomes let's desire. And then Tamar says, for there is no love where there is no will, and there is no faithfulness where there is no trust, which I would read as there is no love where I think you could read it as, right? Will, what does will mean? I think we could read it in our modern language as, for there is no love where there is no consent, right? If both parties aren't willing, aren't desiring of it, it's not a love story. That's not what it is, right? It's not sex, it's rape. It's not a love story if both parties aren't desiring. There's no will if there's no love if there is no will, and there is no faithfulness where there is no trust. That takes that lover relationship and puts it on our relationship with God, where you get to say, we can't be faithful to God if we can't trust you, God. It's not a matter of we won't or we don't want to. It's a matter of, how can we have a text like this and continue to be faithful if we're this afraid of God? There's no faithfulness if there's no trust. And all the scriptures are holy, and Shir HaShirim is the holy of holies. This last line is the line that I think is really powerful to me, right? Because I think this is the line that Tamar has been building to, right? Because Tamar read that Ezekiel text the same way that I read it, and the same way that some people in the chat read it. Like, wow, Ezekiel sounds like a misogynist jerk. Not, this is a holy text, right? And this is a holy text. And Tamar is not willing to give up on saying all the scriptures are holy, right? Kol haktuvim kodesh. All of those scriptures are holy. That's not optional for her faith. And it's not optional for mine. I'm not willing to say, like, X, delete, copy, delete, this piece doesn't go here. She has to find a way to say that. And she can't say it at the beginning of the Midrash. And she works through this Midrash until she gets to a place where she can say, they're all holy. And she can't say they're all holy without saying, B'shir HaShirim, Kodesh Kodeshim. And the Song of Songs is more holy. So she gets to end not just by saying, Ezekiel doesn't stand alone. I can't accept the Ezekiel narrative alone. I have to accept the Ezekiel narrative with a line by line interlinear meshing with this other story, this other version of life where women are supposed to be seen and they're supposed to talk and they're respected and they're equal in the love relationship. I can't read one without the other. And actually, they're not equal. The second text is better. Shir HaShirim is better. And that's the text that I prefer. And there's nothing like apikoros is the phrase I want to use. I'm trying to think how to translate that. There's nothing heretical about her saying these texts are not created equal. One's better than the other. Right? She's saying the Ezekiel text is less holy than the Shir HaShirim text. That sounds like an inappropriate and heretical thing to say. But guess what? Rabbi Akiva said it in that first passage that we looked at the top, right? She didn't make it up. She's copying it from Rabbi Akiva. And if Rabbi Akiva can say it, we can say it, right? She's just saying, yeah, Rabbi Akiva was right. This text is a better text. This is a holier text. This is a more powerful text. And that brings her around to be able to get to this place where she can say Midrash is a tool for keeping the text in. Someone wrote on the bottom, like, why do we have to keep Ezekiel? And maybe you don't, right? If you're a person who isn't interested in working on figuring that out, who Ezekiel is, then this may not be a good enough answer. But if you're a person who's trying to say, yeah, I'm not willing to give up on the idea that the whole Bible is hard. And I would say, even if you're willing to write off Ezekiel, you might not be willing to write off all of the texts in that first list that we made, right? When I said, what are the texts that hurt you? You might not all be willing to say, like, let's just throw out the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. We don't really need that story. That's too offensive, and not like what happens to the Torah, right? If we go through with a red pen and we're cutting out everything that's offensive, then we become more and more sensitive readers and we become offended by more and more. And suddenly, like, what are we left with? That may not be an approach that we want to take. It's not the approach that I want to take. I don't even think I would say to you that I want these texts to be holy or that I think they are holy. It's like, I know them to be holy, right? When I'm reading verses of the Torah, they feel holy to me. And I have to take them seriously and I have to grapple with them. And I think that Tamar in these Midrashim has given us that gift. She's given us the possibility to use Midrash, to use close reading as a tool for being able to keep these texts inside our tradition. And then I would say, like, one step broader than that is again, when I start to think about, like, what is Torah for the Me Too movement? For those who have been with us for the whole series, I've said, I think Tamar always has another social issue or something that she's addressing. Although I've never really gotten to speak to her about it. So I'll be excited to do that in February in the CSP gathering. But I think that what I'm taking from her and I think could be useful to us is to say, actually, this kind of tool, like, how could it be used even beyond the page, even beyond keeping the texts that are difficult in our narrative, but to say, how do we read difficult testimony, right? How do you read the pages and pages of testimony of violence against women from the Me Too testimonials on websites and other places? How do you read those and then continue to still, like, believe in humanity? Is like, well, we find these other narratives, we find these other love stories, and we find a way to weave them together. And we say, like, for everyone who behaves this way, there's a narrative that behaves that way, and that narrative is holier, that narrative is better, and we try to hold that one up. And in that way, we sort of hold our whole lives together. So I think that I will close with that, and just close with a thank you to this group for engaging and exploring these midrashim. And they are available now in Hebrew, but they will be available some in translation. And so I hope you continue to explore them. And I hope also that they inspire you to just study Midrash more generally. And if that's something that's exciting to you, as always, you can turn to Hadar for a lot of opportunities for more learning. And I hope we'll get to learn with you again. And especially hope that I'll get to see you again in February 23rd, I think, to learn with Tamar.
Thank you, Rabbi Killip. I think, the word maverick came to my mind because I think your teaching is really a work of art. These 3 sessions, and in this one also willing to engage in such difficult texts. I think the chat was overflowing with the difficulty of accepting them, and you addressed that at the end, and it's really a midrash, which is almost like a meta of how to look at these, and it's beautiful and precious to study with you. So thank you so much. As you mentioned, we'll have the conversation and interview with Tamar Biala on February 23rd, and with you on Wednesday. And I've just dropped the link in the chat, and you'll all obviously will receive links and everything. I hope you have a happy birthday and enjoy it immensely. And thank you for sharing some of it with us.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good night from Israel. And you're welcome to check out the rest of the CSP programs on our website. Good night.